For centuries, we've been told a simple story that after the fall of Rome, Europe plunged into 1,000 years of darkness, an age of ignorance, superstition, violence, and complete intellectual stagnation. But what if this picture is almost entirely wrong? What if the period we casually call the Dark Ages was not dark at all? And the real darkness came from the way later historians chose to describe it? Why do we still believe that medieval people thought the earth was flat, even though no historical document from the time says so? Why do we imagine a world where knowledge disappeared, when in reality universities, scientific debates, advanced engineering, and medical texts continue to grow? And perhaps the biggest question of all, who invented the idea of the Dark Ages, and why? In this video, we are going to explore all of these questions slowly, carefully, and with evidence. We'll look at the facts, the misconceptions, the archaeological discoveries, and the forgotten stories that completely overturn the popular narrative. Because once you look beneath the surface, the so-called Dark Ages start to look surprisingly bright. To understand how this myth began, we first need to understand who shaped Europe's memory. When the Roman Empire collapsed in the 5th century, it didn't explode overnight. It fragmented, transformed, and gradually shifted from centralized imperial rule to a patchwork of kingdoms. Later Renaissance writers, trying to glorify their own era, looked backward and declared that everything between themselves and Rome must have been miserable. Petrarch, the famous Italian scholar, is one of the first to call the medieval period dark. But he wasn't describing the entire continent. He was mostly complaining about the lack of classical Latin literature in his library. Yet over time, his poetic frustration became a historical label. This label was strengthened during the Enlightenment. Thinkers like Voltaire and Gibbon wanted to promote the triumph of reason over religion. So they painted the Middle Ages as a time controlled entirely by the Church of Time, when science could not grow. Their writings were powerful, influential, and widely read. And this narrative of darkness, ignorance, and clerical control became the dominant view for centuries. But the reality, as modern historians increasingly admit, is far more complex. Let's begin with a basic fact. The knowledge of the ancient world did not disappear. It moved. It changed hands. It evolved. Inside monasteries, monks copied manuscripts by candlelight, thousands of them. A single monastery could preserve works of mathematics, astronomy, agriculture, philosophy, medicine, and engineering. The entire survival of classical literature is owed to these dark centuries. Without them, we would not have Aristotle, Cicero, Virgil, or countless others. Far from being ignorant, these communities were intellectual centers. Outside the monasteries, Europe was not silent either. Archaeological remains of the so-called Dark Ages show large-scale metalwork, sophisticated farming tools, water mills, windmills, complex ship designs, and urban expansion. In some regions, technology improved beyond Roman levels, particularly in agriculture and architecture. The heavy plow revolutionized farming in Northern Europe. Rotating crop systems increased harvests. Water-powered machines spread across the continent. When we think of the Middle Ages, we imagine tiny mud villages. But cities like Constantinople, Cordoba, Paris, Venice, and London were growing, trading, and expanding cultural networks. Trade routes connected Europe with Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. Viking ships crossed the Atlantic. Islamic scholars debated Greek philosophy. Jewish communities wrote scientific treatises. Knowledge flowed across borders far more than people assume. Take education, for example. The world's first universities emerged not in the Renaissance, but during the medieval period. Bologna, Paris, Oxford, Cambridge, Padua. These institutions taught logic, mathematics, astronomy, medicine, law, and rhetoric. Students argued, professors debated, and knowledge grew through structured academic discourse centuries before the Renaissance began. Even the claim that everyone thought the world was flat is false. Medieval scholars knew the earth was spherical. They inherited this from the Greeks. Textbooks used in the 9th, 10th, 11th, and 12th centuries include globe diagrams. Sailors navigated using curved Earth concepts. The real flat Earth myth was invented in the 1800s by a few American writers trying to portray the Middle Ages as foolish. So where exactly is the darkness? Some argue the darkness lay in political fragmentation and frequent warfare. But war existed across every era, including the Roman Empire, which spent centuries fighting. Others argue the darkness was religious. Yet this same religious world produced magnificent architecture, preserved ancient texts, sparked philosophical schools, and encouraged scholarship. To get closer to the truth, we need to examine the early medieval period roughly. 500 to 1000 CE, this time did see instability. Urban life decreased. Trade networks shrank. Epidemics and invasions, Huns, Goths, Vikings strained societies. This was not a golden age. But calling it dark implies ignorance, which is inaccurate. One example of the era's sophistication is the Doomsday Book of 1086, an incredibly detailed economic survey of England that records population, land use, taxation, livestock statistics, and agricultural productivity with remarkable precision. It shows administrative complexity, not chaos. The Carolingian Renaissance in the 8th and 9th centuries shows another sign of intellectual revival. Under Charlemagne, scholars from across Europe gathered to reform writing, education, law, and literacy. They'd created a new standardized handwriting, Carolingian minuscule, which made reading faster and copying more accurate. This script later became the basis of our modern lowercase letters. Meanwhile, in the Islamic world, a vast scientific revolution was taking place, often called the Golden Age of Islam. European, African, Persian, Jewish, and Arab scholars exchanged ideas freely in Baghdad, Cairo, Cordoba, and Damascus. They studied algebra, optics, astronomy, medicine, and chemistry. Many of these works later entered Europe through translation movements, fueling the growth of Western science. Again, the so-called Dark Ages look less dark than expected. But why did the myths survive so long? Because the Renaissance writers wanted to distance themselves from the past. They wanted to present themselves as the rebirth of civilization. To do this, they needed an age to contrast themselves against. The medieval period became the scapegoat. Modern evidence, however ranging from archaeological excavations to manuscript studies, economic records, climate data, and technological histories, shows a world that was changing, adapting, struggling at times, but never intellectually dead. Yet some confusion remains because different regions developed at different speeds. Northern Europe was not the same as the Mediterranean. England was not the same as Italy. Some areas experienced population decline while others experienced growth. The early Middle Ages were uneven patches of brightness, patches of struggle. But darkness as a blanket label is misleading. If anything, the true darkness was not about ignorance, but about how later centuries chose to erase medieval achievements from collective memory. And this brings us to another important question. If the Dark Ages never existed as commonly portrayed, then what does that tell us about the way we write history? What does it tell us about the power of narrative? And what does it tell us about how easily society can be convinced of something that isn't true? These questions form the core of our investigation as we continue deeper into the story. Yet even as Europe slowly rediscovered external connections, another story was unfolding, one that completely undermines the popular belief that everything was frozen between 500 and 1500. What we call the Dark Ages was actually the era when the foundations of the modern world were laid. The mechanical clock was invented in medieval monasteries, not during the Renaissance. Eyeglasses, one of the most underrated inventions in human progress, were developed by 13th century Italian artisans. Improved plows, horse collars, and crop rotation systems transformed agriculture, raising population and stabilizing food supplies. Even the idea of universities, formal institutions built on lectures, degrees, and academic specialization, was a purely medieval innovation. But perhaps the strongest argument against the darkness narrative comes from the way medieval Europeans copied, preserved, and expanded ancient knowledge. During this time, scribes across Europe were reproducing the works of Aristotle, Cicero, Virgil, Euclid, and countless others. If it were truly an age of ignorance, why was so much effort invested in saving books from a civilization long gone? Rather than burying the past, the Middle Ages were obsessed with recovering it. At the same time, Christian theologians such as Augustine and Aquinas were producing philosophical works that shaped Western thought for centuries. The idea that medieval Europe neither thought nor invented becomes harder to defend the more closely we look at the evidence. And this is where the myth becomes even more problematic. The phrase Dark Ages itself did not even originate in the period it describes. It was invented centuries later, during the Renaissance, by scholars who wanted to paint themselves as the heroes who revived civilization from barbarism. To make themselves look enlightened, they exaggerated the darkness of everything that came before them. Later, Enlightenment thinkers repeated the same argument using the Middle Ages as a rhetorical device to criticize religion, monarchy, and tradition. Historians now agree that the term was a form of intellectual propaganda, a convenient label used to oversimplify 1,000 years of complex history. So why, despite abundant evidence, does the myth still survive? Part of the reason is storytelling. Narratives have power, and the idea of a 1,000-year blackout is so dramatic, so simple, and so emotionally compelling that it refuses to die. Films, textbooks, and popular culture often portray medieval people as dirty, ignorant, superstitious, and technologically backward in image that is easy to digest and easy to repeat. It is far more engaging to imagine Europe stuck in the mud until Da Vinci suddenly arrived to save it. But real history is almost never that simple. Another reason is that modern societies tend to judge the past by present standards. When we look back and compare medieval Europe to our world of smartphones, satellites, and global connectivity, it feels primitive. But this is not a fair comparison. When measured against their predecessors, the declining Roman world, medieval societies were innovators. They improved agriculture, political structures, legal systems, and military technology. The Middle Ages saw the rise of the English common law, the Magna Carta, Gothic architecture, maritime trade networks, mechanical engineering, and early financial institutions. These were not signs of decline but signs of transformation. None of this means the Middle Ages were a paradise. Far from it. There was war, disease, inequality, and suffering just as there had been in ancient Rome and just as there would be in early modern Europe. But darkness was not the defining feature of the age. Change was. Survival was. Adaptation was. Even the Black Death, which is often used as proof of medieval stagnation, led to massive economic and social restructuring that shaped the modern labor system. History is messy, and progress is rarely a straight line. But calling a millennium dark, simply because it does not fit neatly into our modern values, ignores both the resilience and creativity of the people who lived through it. And there is another overlooked dimension, the explosion of culture. Medieval Europe produced Dante's Divine Comedy, Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, the Nibelungen Lied, and a vast collection of epics, romances, and poems. Cathedral art reached heights unmatched in earlier Western history. The stained glass windows of Chartres are still considered masterpieces. The concept of chivalry, knightly honor, and courtly love, all romanticized endlessly today, came straight from medieval society, not from antiquity. Even the languages we speak, English, French, Italian, Spanish, Portuguese, German, emerged in recognizable form during the Middle Ages. The medieval world was not a pause between two golden ages. It was the bridge that created the world we know. Still, the most intriguing part of this entire debate lies in the psychological impact of calling a period dark. It subtly encourages the belief that progress is linear, that civilization rises, falls, and rises again with clear, dramatic breaks. But history rarely works like that. The decline of Rome did not erase human intelligence. The Renaissance did not appear out of thin air. The Enlightenment was not a sudden burst of reason imposed on a barbaric age. What truly happened was a continuous flow, a long, sometimes chaotic, sometimes brilliant evolution of ideas, technologies, and cultures. Over the past few decades, archaeologists, historians, and scientists have been quietly rewriting what we know. Excavations across Europe have revealed dense trade networks, advanced craftsmanship, and surprisingly sophisticated urban planning. Ice core samples show increased mining and manufacturing activity much earlier than we once believed. Newly studied manuscripts reveal scientific knowledge that contradicts the stereotype of medieval ignorance. Each discovery chips away at the myth, showing us that the Middle Ages were neither uniquely dark nor uniquely stagnant. But perhaps the biggest misunderstanding comes from looking only at Europe. Much of what we consider European progress was actually global. The Islamic Golden Age, the scientific advances of China, the mathematics of India, and the innovations of Africa all fed into Europe's growth. To call the period dark is not only inaccurate, it is also Eurocentric. The world was thriving, exchanging ideas, inventing technologies, and pushing intellectual boundaries. The problem is not that the Middle Ages were dark. It is that our perspective has been narrow. In the end, the myth persists because it serves a purpose. It justifies colonial narratives, glorifies certain periods over others, and reinforces simplistic versions of history that are easy to teach and easy to market. It allows us to pretend that civilization rises in clean breaks, Roman brilliance, medieval darkness, Renaissance rebirth, when the truth is a long, complicated continuum. The Middle Ages were not a blackout in human history. They were a laboratory where new social, technological, and intellectual experiments took place. And this forces us to ask a final question. Why does the myth matter? It matters because the way we tell history shapes how we see ourselves. If we believe that 1,000 years were lost to ignorance, we may begin to think that progress is fragile, that civilization collapses easily, or that certain cultures are naturally superior. But if we understand that even during times of political fragmentation and economic hardship, people create, innovate, and adapt, then the story changes. It becomes a story of resilience, not regression. The truth is simple. There was no single dark age. There were difficult periods, great triumphs, moments of loss, and moments of brilliance, just like any other era. The darkness was never in the centuries themselves. It was in how later generations chose to portray them. And as we pull back the curtain, as more evidence emerges, the myth becomes harder to defend. What we find instead is a vibrant, complex, inventive millennium that deserves far more credit than it gets. So next time someone casually repeats that the Middle Ages were 1,000 years of darkness, the real question to ask is, dark for whom? Dark compared to what? Because the more we uncover, the more one truth becomes undeniable. What we call the Dark Ages were never truly dark at all. They were the shadowed beginning of the modern world, waiting for us to finally see them for what they really were.